Welcome to week 9 of Sunday Night Football. Tonight we've got the Tennessee Titans against the Kansas City Chiefs. For Tennessee, we're going to do a couple of racks of spare ribs. Ribs are a big part of Tennessee style barbecue. Going to add a little bit of heat to the rub, a little bit more than usual, and see how that turns out. For Kansas City, you've seen me do the burnt ends already a couple of times. I have had a few people asking me how I do my beans, since I've mentioned that I do that with the trimmings from brisket or ribs, and that's a big part of Kansas City barbecue also. You gotta have good burnt ends, but the sides have to live up to it also. So I'm gonna show you how I do my Kansas City style barbecue baked beans. For Tennessee, we have some ribs that we're gonna do here. I've got 2 racks of St. Louis cut spare ribs. So I trimmed these down, any little floating pieces out here that weren't going to be sitting on the bones very nicely. I've trimmed and put in this foil pan. Those are not going to go to waste. That's going to go into beans. I always do something with the trimmings like that. But now we've got these 2 nicely squared racks of St. Louis cut ribs. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to get my seasoning on these. I'm not going to be using a binder today. You certainly can, but I'm not going to today. So for my seasoning, I've got it already mixed here. There's brown sugar, paprika, chili powder, salt, pepper, cumin, mustard powder, and garlic powder. I like a rub pretty much similar to that for anything I do pork. If you're going to be adding sauce or glaze to the rubs later to make them sticky, you want to hold off on the brown sugar. You want to get the sweetness at the end in that case. I'm doing a dry rack of ribs here. I'm not adding a sauce at the end, so I'm going to get that sweetness on now and let it cook in. So all I'm going to be doing now that I've got it trimmed up is getting all of that seasoning onto the ribs. I'm going to get both sides here, every little bit of surface I can find. Do a pretty healthy dose of this. Back through and get any areas that didn't get hit the first time. Get those flipped over. Do the same thing here on the back side. You can see there's this flap here. I already trimmed that down also. It's perfectly good meat to have on the ribs, but it does make them cook a little bit awkwardly. It makes that one area thicker than the rest. If you're not wanting to do anything with the trimmings, you'll want to leave that on because it is good meat. But if you're doing beans or anything like that where the trimmings would go to use, then I would rather just do it that way and keep these nice and even all the way around so that they cook as evenly as possible. Gonna want them all to get done at the same time. Nice even cook. Along up here along the edges. Alright, and I'm going to do the same thing to the other rack of ribs. I'm going to let this seasoning sit on here for about 20 to 30 minutes at least while the grill is coming up to temperature. That way flavors are going to be soaked in there and get absorbed a little bit better. Just that little extra time does make a difference. You get a more even flavor. That flavor permeates all the way down to the meat, and I really like that difference. So as soon as the smoker comes up to temp, as soon as the charcoal is ready to go, I'll get these ribs thrown on there, and then they'll be ready to start cooking. For the Kansas City side of things, you've seen me do the burnt ends before, so I wanted to switch things up. Another big staple of Kansas City barbecue is the side, and especially having some good barbecue baked beans. So I'm going to show you how I do my own, especially with the trimmings from the ribs. That worked out really nicely. So I've got all of the trimmings that I showed you earlier from the ribs. I've got those cut up into cubes. There's no bones and no pieces in here that are pure fat, but as you can see, there's a lot of them that do have some fat. That's just going to melt and make the beans extra juicy. And I've got a whole chopped white onion and a whole chopped green bell pepper. Sometimes I use more than one pepper, sometimes I use a jalapeno. Just kind of depends on what I'm in the mood for that day. From here, I'm going to add 2 cans of Bush's baked beans. Whatever flavor you want to use is fine. I've got brown sugar hickory ones today. I've used those before, they're really good with this. And then give it some extra flavoring here. I've got some of the leftover rub that I used earlier on the pork, so that's going to give it same flavor profile. That all dumped in there. And then make sure it doesn't dry out on the smoker. Gonna get a little extra moisture here from some yellow mustard, from some barbecue sauce, give it a little extra sweetness too. I'm not trying to get a whole lot of any of these things, just enough to help give it some extra flavor and keep it from drying out in the fire. And then a splash of Worcestershire sauce and a shot or 2 of bourbon. You don't have to use super nice bourbon for this. It's going to cook out and you're just going to be left with a little bit of extra zing to the flavor. Now I'm going to get this all mixed up. I'll show you what it looks like after that, and then we'll get it on the fire with the ribs. The ribs have been on for a couple hours. You can see they've got a good smoky exterior and they're starting to pull back a little bit from the bones. At this point you can wrap them to ensure that they don't dry out. That's a really good way to do it. Or you can just take a whole thing of beans and set it directly under the ribs. So as any juices, fat, anything like that comes off of the meat, it's just going to fall into the beans and give them extra flavoring. And as the beans start to get steamy from all the extra heat, that's just going to keep the ribs nice and juicy. This is a little trick I love to do whenever I'm doing anything big that's going to be on for a long time, like ribs or brisket. If there's any sort of trimming I can do, stick that in with the beans and it's just going to make everything come out that much better. So I'm going to leave this on until the ribs are really pulling back from the bones and it starts to get just a jiggly consistency all the way through. The top one still has a ways to go, the bottom one's starting to get close already, and then it'll all be ready to go. So we brought in the ribs and the beans together at the same time. The beans are still steaming a little bit. You can see there's a lot more to it than just the beans itself. You can see the peppers, you can see the onions, you can see some of that good pork meat in there. It's going to have a lot of different flavors blended together. And that steam was keeping the ribs nice and juicy. These were not wrapped at any point, but they're still soft on the outside. They didn't dry out. Alright, so just find the little seam between the bones. Let the bones guide the knife the rest of the way down. And for me, it's always easier to cut them when they're standing up like this instead of when they're laying down. It's hard to kind of see where the bone runs because it doesn't always run perfectly perpendicular. You see these, it's kind of angled more. But if you just let the bones guide you, it'll work out just fine. You do run into this little bit of cartilage down here, which kind of fights back against you sometimes. That's okay. So we've got here 2 full racks of St. Louis cut ribs. And again, the beans being made with all of the trimmings off of those ribs, along with lots of other good stuff to sweeten them up a little bit. Thanks again for watching week 9 of Sunday Night Football. We had Kansas City, where we did our baked beans, a little change of pace there. And for Tennessee, the Titans, we did our St. Louis cut spare ribs. Both of them turned out really well. Really happy with how everything went. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, share, subscribe as always. And thanks as always to my lovely wife, Evelise, for doing all the recording and editing. And hope to see you next week.